code complexity is ramping up now. We're talking conditional statements. So this is going to be your if-else statement kind of situation. It's going to look a little bit different in Python than it does in other languages, but the basic structure is the same. So we're going to introduce the idea of control flow, or just say flow control instead. This is including not only conditional statements, but a few other things that we're going to talk about for a good chunk of the course. We're going to look at exactly what a conditional statement is, the different types of setups that we have in Python. You have the if statement, you have the if-else, and then you have the if-else. And then we're going to talk about different ways that we could solve the same problem using a chain of elifs, a series of basic ifs, or something else. So, introduction to control flow. This is how we can manipulate the order of execution for our code. Until now, everything we've done has just been from top to bottom. But with control flow, you can change where your code goes. You can introduce branching paths. And this is how we make our code much more flexible, much more fault tolerant, among many, many other things. And we have a few different types of control flow. We have preprocessor commands like the import or include command in other languages. You have functions, which we've already talked about. We stop, we go execute the function that is named, we come back with some kind of output, and we assign it to the variable that called it. We have conditionals, which we're going to talk about here. Then there are loops, there's pattern matching, and so on and so forth. We're going to cover pretty much all the different kinds of control flow in this course. So, what are conditional statements? These are a simple binary flow control structure. You have a statement that is evaluated, returns true or false. If it's true, we go one direction. If it's false, we go the other direction. If you think back to the flowcharts lecture, this is actually the exact same flowchart that was used there. So we have a number called x, it equals 5. We want to ask, is it even? In other words, if x mod 2 is 0, and if it's true, then we double it. If it's false, we triple it. This is a very basic example of a conditional statement. And it contains 3 separate types of block. Now we're introducing blocks. So this is going to introduce a particular kind of syntax that you need to be very careful with. So the 3 types of block headers we have are first your if statement. This is always the first one that is checked. That condition is evaluated. If it is true, the code contained within the if block is run. If it is not, then it's skipped. We then have the elif, also called else if in other programming languages. If this exists and your initial if is false, then we run our elif. You can have an indefinite number of elifs. So your first elif will be checked. If it's false, it goes on to the second one. If that's false, it goes on to the third. And so on and so forth until there are no more elifs. And then finally, we have the else, which is, you could think of it as a last resort. If your if fails, if it comes back false, if all your elifs come back false, then your else will be run by default. So there's always one if. That is the first thing that is checked. There's an indefinite number of elifs. You can have 0, 1, 2, 38, doesn't matter. Though if you have more than a few, you might want to try some other way of writing your code. Lastly, the else, there can be 0 of these, there can be 1 of these. And these are run if all other conditions prior to it in the chain fail. And we're going to see what that looks like in code and later on in the slides, and then we're going to do a ton of examples to make sure that these are well understood. So the flowchart on the right, again, this shows what your if statement is going to look like visually. But we're going to move straight on. So here's what your code is going to look like for a basic if. So we have the variable age, which is assigned to input for how old are you, that we then cast to an integer. We ask if age is less than 18, and if so, we print you may not enter. Regardless, we then print have a nice day. And then we see the output here. We ask, how old are you? If we gave it 17, it'll say you may not enter, and then followed by have a nice day. If we gave it 19, then the print you may not enter line would be skipped, and all you would see is have a nice day. Now we move on to an if else. And this is arguably the most common way you're going to see your conditional statements. 2 blocks. If your condition is true, we execute the first thing. If your condition is false, we execute the second. So again, we're asking, how old are you, using an input, and then we are casting that input to an integer and storing it in age. If age is less than 18, we print you may not enter, just as before. Otherwise, else, we print welcome in. And again, regardless of the outcome, we print have a nice day. And you see over here, for our input, I gave 19, and it says welcome in, have a nice day. One thing I want to go ahead and call your attention to is when you are starting a block, there are 2 very, very, very important things that you need to pay attention to. This is going to be the case for conditionals, for loops, for functions, for classes, for basically every structure we do going forward besides collections. You have a header. That header ends with a colon. And then everything that belongs in that block is indented by 1 level. You see the 2 marks. That is because I prefer my indentations to be 4 spaces. But as long as they are all on the same indentation level, that tells Python they belong to the same block. It is critical that you understand where lines are supposed to go for indentation. If you do not have your indentation absolutely perfect, it will not work. And when you start nesting things inside of other things, when you start, say, nesting a loop inside of an if statement, you have to be doubly careful, because inside that while loop is now indented by 2 levels. It is now 8 spaces over all of its contents, while the while itself, the header, is indented out only once, and then the if statement is not indented at all. It is highly important that you understand where these are supposed to go. So we're going to do a bunch, and I mean a bunch of examples. We're going to use as much time as we can to make sure you understand how to do your indentation, how to write all these, because in previous attempts to teach this course, that was a major, major sticking point. Finally, if else. In other programming languages, it's if else. But Python combines else and if into one word. So, once again, last time, we have an input that asks, how old are you? This input is cast to an int, and then it is stored in age. Oh. Pardon that. My Windows Explorer decided, hey, I'm going to jump up in your face. So, okay. Once again, let's start over. You're doing an input that asks, how old are you? That is being cast to an int and then being stored in age. We ask, if age less than 18, you may not enter. We print that. Elif, here's our second condition that we check. If age is less than 21. In this case, because we have already checked that age is not less than 18, it is greater than or equal. Now we are checking if it is also less than 21. So in this case, our elif is going to be true if the user is 19 or 18, 19, or 20. And in this case, it says you may enter, but you may not drink. And then we have our else. In this case, else means that the user is 21 or older. Help yourself to whatever you like is what we print in that case. And again, in all cases, after the fact, we print have a nice day. And you see here, how old are you? 21. Help yourself to whatever you like. Have a nice day. We'll practice these until we're blue in the face, but there's one more point that I want to talk about, and that is whether we want to use just a string of if statements, an if, elif, else chain, or something else. Generally speaking, though this is not always the case, elif chains can execute faster than a series of ifs because only one of these is guaranteed to work. If you do an if, elif, else, one of these is going to work. If you just have a bunch of ifs, multiple of them can evaluate to true, and then they will all execute, all the ones that evaluate to true. This may be what you want in your code. This may not be what you want. In general, you want to use if, elif, else. Sometimes you might need if instead. So a series of ifs can be more flexible and in a few cases easier to read. Just keep that in mind. The only way you're going to really know when to use what is just to practice. I can't really show you a generalized example that's really accurate to how you can decide whether to use if, elif, else, or just a bunch of ifs. One thing I can tell you is if you have more than 5 conditional statements, you might want to use some other structure like pattern matching. We're going to talk about the match case statement later on in these lectures. This is preferable to using if, elif, 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 else. If your if, elif, else chain goes on and on and on, because this is even more efficient and often more readable. So when we come back next time, we're going to talk about some examples. We're going to code our way through as many examples as I feel we need. So stay tuned for that.